Good evening all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight we venture into one of the most haunted regions in America, where ancient mountains guard secrets darker than death itself. 10 disturbing true accounts await you from the Appalachian deep woods, where reality and nightmare intertwine among the endless trees. These are not legends passed down through generations. These are first-hand encounters with evil, both human and otherwise, experienced by those who dared to walk where the wilderness still rules. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now let us step into the shadows of the Appalachian deep woods, where civilization ends and terror begins. This happened to Ethan during the autumn of 2019 when he was 26 years old and working a job that had slowly been draining every ounce of joy from his life. He had grown up in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in eastern Kentucky, but after college he had moved to Charlotte for work. The years in the city had been suffocating. The noise, the crowds, the endless concrete stretching in every direction. He found himself longing for the quiet solitude of the mountains, for the smell of pine and earth, for nights where the only sound was wind moving through ancient trees. So, when October rolled around and he had accumulated enough vacation days, Ethan decided to do something he had been dreaming about for months. A solo camping trip deep in the Daniel Boone National Forest, far from the designated campgrounds, where families gathered with their RVs and generators. He wanted true wilderness, the kind of isolation that would let him hear his own thoughts again. He spent weeks planning, studying topographical maps, identifying a remote area near the border of McCreary County where the trails disappeared and the forest became dense and unforgiving. He told his girlfriend Sarah about the trip, and she had been less than enthusiastic. She worried about him going alone, worried about what could happen if he got injured or lost. But Ethan assured her he knew what he was doing. He had grown up hiking these mountains. He knew how to read terrain, how to navigate by compass, how to respect the wilderness. He promised to check in when he got back to cell service. She made him promise to be careful, and he kissed her forehead and told her not to worry. The drive from Charlotte took nearly 6 hours. Ethan left before dawn on a Friday morning, watching the sun rise over the mountains as he wound his way through increasingly narrow roads. By mid-morning, he had reached the Forest Service road that would take him to his chosen trailhead. The road was barely maintained, full of potholes and loose gravel. He passed one other vehicle coming out, a rusted pickup truck with 2 men inside who stared at him as they passed. Something about their eyes made Ethan uncomfortable, but he pushed the feeling aside. He parked at the trailhead, which was really just a widening in the road where the forest opened slightly. There was no sign, no marker, just the beginning of an old logging road that disappeared into the trees. Ethan shouldered his pack, locked his car, and started walking. The weight of the pack was familiar and comforting. He had everything he needed for 3 days and 2 nights. Tent, sleeping bag, water filtration system, food, first aid kit, knife, and his grandfather's old compass. The first few hours of hiking were exactly what he had needed. The logging road gradually faded into a game trail, and then into nothing at all. He navigated by compass and instinct, moving deeper into the forest where the canopy grew thick, overhead, and the undergrowth became tangled and wild. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional bird call and the sound of his own breathing. He felt the tension of city life beginning to melt away with each step. By late afternoon, Ethan found the spot he had been looking for, a small clearing on a ridge with a view down into a hollow where a creek ran far below. The trees here were massive, old-growth hardwoods that had somehow escaped the logging operations decades ago. He set down his pack and took a moment to just breathe, to take in the absolute solitude. There was no sign that any human had been here in years, maybe decades. Fallen leaves carpeted the ground in thick layers, and moss covered the rocks in brilliant green. He spent the next hour setting up camp. He pitched his tent in the center of the clearing, arranged stones for a fire ring, gathered firewood from the surrounding forest. The work was meditative, and he found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Ethan started a small fire and heated water for a freeze-dried meal. It was while he was eating, watching the flames dance, that he first noticed something was wrong. The light was fading quickly, the way it does in the mountains, where the sun disappears behind ridges long before actual sunset. In the growing darkness, he swept his flashlight around the perimeter of his camp, just checking his surroundings out of habit. That was when he saw them. Footprints in the soft earth near his tent, boot prints, clearly human, forming a rough circle around where he had set up his camp. Ethan stood up slowly, his heart beginning to pound. He had been here for over an hour. He had walked the entire perimeter while gathering firewood. Those prints had not been there when he arrived. He was certain of it. The disturbed leaves, the fresh impressions in the mud near a small seep spring, these were recent. Very recent. He called out into the darkness. "Hello? Is someone there?" His voice sounded small and fragile in the vast forest. No response came, just the whisper of wind through the trees and the crackle of his fire. Ethan felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Someone had been watching him while he set up camp. Someone had walked in a circle around his site while he was distracted with the fire and his meal. And that someone had done it silently enough that he had not heard a thing. Ethan made a decision. He would not sleep tonight. He built up his fire larger than necessary, creating a barrier of light around his camp. He kept his knife within reach and his flashlight in hand. The temperature was dropping as the night deepened, and he wrapped himself in his sleeping bag, but remained sitting up, back against a tree, facing out into the darkness beyond the firelight. The hours crawled by. Midnight came and went. Ethan forced himself to stay alert, listening to every sound. The forest at night is never truly silent. There are always small noises, branches creaking, leaves rustling, animals moving through the underbrush. But around 1 in the morning, he heard something different. Footsteps, deliberate, measured, walking slowly through the leaves, circling his camp again. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and shadows. For just a moment, he saw movement. A figure, definitely human, stepping behind a large oak tree. "I know you're out there," Ethan shouted. "What do you want?" Still no response, just silence. And then, from a completely different direction, he heard the footsteps again. His blood went cold. There was more than one of them. He stayed awake until dawn, feeding the fire constantly, sweeping his light across the perimeter every few minutes. Twice more he saw movement, shadows that did not quite behave like shadows should. Once, he heard what sounded like whispered voices, too far away to make out words. By the time the sun began to rise, painting the forest in shades of gray and gold, Ethan was exhausted and terrified. In the growing light, he quickly broke down his camp. He did not bother with breakfast, did not take time to be careful or methodical. He just wanted to get out. As he stuffed his tent into his pack with shaking hands, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. His backpack had been moved. He had left it propped against a tree on the opposite side of the clearing from where he had been sitting. Now it was several feet away from that tree, and the zipper on one of the side pockets was open. Someone had gone through his things while he was focused on watching the tree line. Ethan checked quickly. His wallet was still there, his keys, his phone. Nothing seemed to be missing, but someone had touched his belongings, had unzipped his pack and looked inside, all while he was sitting 20 feet away. The violation of it made him feel sick. He shouldered his pack and started hiking. He did not follow his original route. Instead, he headed straight downhill toward where he knew the creek would be, knowing that if he followed the water downstream, it would eventually lead him to a road or a trail. The hiking was brutal, steep and treacherous, but he pushed through exhaustion and fear. and that was when he realized he was being followed. The sounds behind him were not subtle. Whoever it was, they were not trying to be quiet anymore. He could hear them crashing through the underbrush, keeping pace with him. When he sped up, they sped up. When he slowed down, they slowed down. Ethan's mind raced. He thought about his knife, about trying to defend himself, but he knew that would be suicide. There were at least 2 of them, maybe more. His only chance was to keep moving, to reach civilization before they decided to do whatever it was they were planning. The creek appeared. Below him, a ribbon of water cutting through a narrow gorge. He scrambled down the rocky slope, losing his footing twice and sliding several feet before catching himself. Behind him, he heard voices now, clear and unmistakable. 2 men talking to each other. He is heading for the water. Cut him off at the bend. They were coordinating. They were hunting him. Ethan hit the creek bed and started running, splashing through ankle-deep water, his boots soaked immediately. The cold water shocked his system, gave him a burst of adrenaline. He ran harder than he had ever run in his life, his pack bouncing painfully against his back, his lungs burning. The creek bed was full of slippery rocks and hidden holes, and every step threatened to twist an ankle or send him sprawling, but he did not slow down. He did not know how long he ran. Time lost meaning. The world narrowed to just the creek, the rocks, the desperate need to keep moving. And then, impossibly, he heard a sound that was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard in his life. A car engine. Somewhere ahead, beyond the trees, a vehicle was moving on a road. Ethan scrambled up the creek bank, tearing through briars that shredded his pants and cut his hands. He burst through a final tangle of undergrowth and found himself standing on a gravel Forest Service road. 20 yards away, a green Forest Service truck was parked, and a ranger in uniform was examining something on a clipboard. Ethan ran toward the truck, stumbling, barely able to form words. The ranger looked up in alarm as this wild-eyed, muddy, bleeding man came running out of the forest. "Help!" Ethan managed to gasp. "Someone following me in the woods." The ranger immediately became alert, his hand moving to the radio on his belt. "How many? Where?" Ethan pointed back toward the creek, trying to catch his breath, trying to explain. The ranger called it in, and within minutes, 2 more ranger vehicles arrived, along with a county sheriff deputy. They went back into the forest, following Ethan's directions to his campsite. It took them nearly 2 hours of hiking to reach the ridge where he had camped. When they arrived, they found his camp area disturbed. Boot prints everywhere, multiple sets circling the clearing. And near the tree line, they found something else, a small tent hidden in the thick underbrush, along with propane burners, plastic tubing, batteries, and containers of chemicals. An illegal methamphetamine cook site. The ranger explained it to Ethan later, back at the ranger station with a cup of coffee warming his shaking hands. The remote areas of the forest had become havens for illegal drug operations. Meth cooks would set up in the deepest, most isolated parts of the woods, far from any trails, and run their operations for weeks or months at a time. They were dangerous, paranoid, often armed, and extremely protective of their territory. Ethan had accidentally set up camp within a quarter-mile of their operation. They had been watching him, trying to decide what to do about him. If he had stayed another night, the ranger said quietly, they likely would have made sure he never told anyone what he had seen. Ethan drove back to Charlotte that afternoon, his hands still shaking on the steering wheel. He called Sarah from the first place he got cell service and told her everything. She cried, and he cried too, realizing how close he had come to disappearing into those mountains forever. The Forest Service and Sheriff Department conducted a raid 2 days later. They arrested 3 men at the cook site and dismantled the operation. It turned out they were wanted in connection with several violent crimes in the area, including the disappearance of a hiker the previous year. Ethan never learned what happened to that hiker, but he could guess. He has not been back to the Daniel Boone National Forest since. The mountains he grew up loving, the wilderness that was supposed to be his sanctuary, had been turned into something else, a hiding place for people who had chosen to put themselves beyond the boundaries of civilization. People who saw other human beings not as fellow souls, but as potential threats to be eliminated. Ethan learned a hard truth that October. Not all monsters in the Appalachian woods are supernatural. Some walk on two legs, speak with human voices, and leave boot prints in the mud. And those are the most dangerous monsters of all because they do not disappear with the sunrise. They are real. They are out there in the deep woods, and they are waiting for the next person who wanders too close to their hidden places. The mountains keep many secrets. Some of them have teeth. Mason grew up in the mountains of West Virginia, in a small town where everybody knew everybody, and the old ways were still remembered. His grandfather had been a coal miner, and his father worked at the processing plant, and Mason was expected to follow the same path. But he had different dreams. He went to college in Morgantown, studying environmental science, planning to work for the Forest Service or maybe the Parks Department. During his summer breaks, though, he always came home. The mountains called to him in a way the city never could. His family owned 40 acres of wooded hillside that had been passed down through 3 generations. The land was steep and rocky, not good for farming, but perfect for hiking. Mason had spent his entire childhood exploring every hollow and ridge, every deer trail and creek bed. He knew that land better than he knew anything else in the world. It was his sanctuary, his thinking place, the spot where he went when he needed to clear his head. The summer he turned 22, Mason came home after completing his junior year. His grandfather had passed away that spring, and the funeral had been small and quiet, the way his grandfather would have wanted it. Mason had not been able to process the grief while he was at school, surrounded by people who had never known the old man, who could not understand what it meant to lose someone who had taught you how to read the weather in the clouds and find your way home by the stars. So one evening in early June, as the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the ridgeline, Mason decided to take a walk on the family land. He told his mother he would be back before full dark, grabbed a flashlight just in case, and headed up the trail that wound behind their house into the deeper woods. The air was thick with humidity, and the smell of honeysuckle hung heavy in the evening warmth. Cicadas had started their evening chorus, that rising and falling drone that is the soundtrack of summer in Appalachia. He walked the familiar paths, letting his feet carry him on autopilot while his mind wandered. He thought about his grandfather, about the stories the old man used to tell, stories about the mines, about the men who went down into the earth and did not come back up, stories about the old days, when the mountains were even wilder than they were now, and stories about the things that lived in the deep woods, the things that the newer generations had forgotten or stopped believing in. His grandfather had been serious about those stories. He had rules that were not to be broken. Never whistle at night. Never answer if you hear your name called in the woods unless you can see who is calling. Never follow a light that seems to float between the trees. Never take anything from a graveyard, not even a pretty stone. His grandfather said these were not superstitions. They were survival. The mountains were old, older than human memory, and they had their own way of doing things. If you wanted to live in the mountains, you had to respect them. Mason had always listened politely to these warnings, the way children do when adults tell them stories that seem quaint and outdated. He believed in the natural world, in ecology and biology and geology. He did not believe in the supernatural, or at least he had not believed in it until that evening. He was about half a mile from the house, standing on a ridge that overlooked a deep hollow when he heard it, a voice clear as day calling his name. Mason. It came from deeper in the woods, from down in the hollow where the old logging road used to run before the forest reclaimed it. Mason stopped walking and listened. The voice came again. "Mason, come here." And the terrible thing, the thing that made his blood run cold even as part of his mind refused to accept what he was hearing, was that the voice sounded exactly like his grandfather. It had the same rough edges, worn smooth by decades of cigarettes and coal dust. It had the same Appalachian accent, the way certain vowels were stretched and others were swallowed. It even had the same slight whistle on the S sounds, the result of a tooth his grandfather had lost in a mining accident in 1967. It was perfect. It was impossible. His grandfather had been dead for 3 months. Mason stood frozen on the ridge, his rational mind at war with his instincts. The rational part said it was impossible, said it had to be a trick of the wind, or a bird, or his own grief-stricken imagination. But his instincts, the deep ancient part of his brain that had kept his ancestors alive through millennia of dangers, that part was screaming at him to run. He remembered his grandfather's rule: never answer if you hear your name called in the woods unless you can see who is calling. But grief is a powerful thing. It makes you do things that your better judgment knows are foolish. Mason wanted so badly to hear his grandfather's voice one more time, to have one more conversation, to say the things he had not gotten to say before the old man passed. So he made a choice that he would regret for the rest of his life. He called back. "Grandpa, is that you?" The response came immediately, and it was filled with warmth and love. "Mason, come down here. I need to show you something." The voice was coming from down in the hollow, somewhere in the thick tangle of rhododendron and mountain laurel that made the understory almost impenetrable. Mason found himself walking down the slope, his feet slipping on the loose rocks and wet leaves, heading toward the voice. "Where are you?" Mason called out as he reached the bottom of the hollow. The air was cooler here, damp and heavy. The canopy overhead was so thick that the fading daylight barely penetrated, and the shadows were deep and strange. "I'm over here, boy. Follow my voice." The voice was moving, always just ahead of him, always just out of sight behind the next tree or the next bend in the old road. Mason pushed through the vegetation, thorns catching on his clothes and scratching his arms. He was deeper into the hollow than he had been in years, far off the maintained trails, in a part of the property that was wild and overgrown. The voice kept calling, kept leading him deeper. "Come on, Mason, just a little further. I have something to show you." It was when he climbed over a fallen hemlock, its massive trunk blocking the old road, that something changed. The voice came again, but this time it sounded wrong. The words were the same, still in that familiar accent, still calling his name. But there was something underneath the sound now, something that did not quite fit. It was as if someone was playing a recording, but the recording had been slightly corrupted, the frequency just a bit off. Mason stopped moving. He was breathing hard from the exertion of pushing through the undergrowth, and his arms were covered in scratches. He looked around, really looked, and realized he did not know exactly where he was. He had been following the voice so intently that he had not been paying attention to landmarks or directions. The hollow looked different from this angle, unfamiliar. The voice came again, and this time the wrongness was unmistakable. "Mason, Mason, Mason." It was repeating his name over and over, and with each repetition it sounded less like his grandfather and more like something else. Something that was trying very hard to imitate a human voice, but did not quite understand how human voices worked. The warm tone was gone, replaced by something flat and hungry. And then he saw it. Through the tangle of rhododendron, maybe 30 yards ahead, standing in what looked like a small clearing. A figure, tall, too tall, dressed in dark clothes that seemed to blend with the shadows. It was standing completely still, facing his direction. Mason could not make out any features, could not see a face, just a dark shape, human in outline but wrong in proportion. The voice came from the figure, but its mouth did not move. "Come here, Mason. Come see." And the voice was changing even more now, becoming distorted, taking on tones that no human throat could produce. It sounded like multiple voices speaking at once, overlapping, some higher and some lower, all saying his name. Terror hit Mason like a physical blow. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to run. He stumbled backward, his heel catching on a root, and he went down hard on his back. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and for a few seconds he could only lie there, gasping. When he looked up, the figure was closer. It had not walked. He had not seen it move, but it was now maybe 20 yards away, still standing motionless, still watching him. Mason scrambled to his feet and ran. He crashed through the undergrowth with no thought for direction or safety, just pure blind panic driving him uphill and away from that thing in the clearing. Branches whipped his face and roots tried to trip him, but he kept moving. And behind him, he could hear the voice. It was following him, keeping pace, and it was angry now. The warm grandfather tones were completely gone, replaced by something that sounded like rocks grinding together, like wind howling through a cave, like a scream played backward. Mason, 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 Mason. The voice was getting louder, more insistent, echoing through the hollow in ways that defied natural acoustics. It was coming from behind him, and in front of him, and above him, surrounding him, and he could not tell anymore where it was actually originating. He just knew he had to get away from it. He burst out of the thick undergrowth onto a trail he recognized, one of the main paths that led back toward the house. The sight of something familiar gave him renewed energy, and he ran harder. The voice was still calling, but it was fading now, growing distant. Or maybe it had stopped following once he reached the maintained trail. He did not stop to find out. He ran all the way home, his lungs burning and his legs shaking. He burst through the back door of his house, wild-eyed and bleeding from a dozen scratches. His mother jumped up from the kitchen table where she had been reading. "Mason, what happened? Are you okay?" He could not speak at first, could only lean against the doorframe and gasp for air. When he finally could form words, he told her everything. His mother's face went very pale as he spoke. When he finished, she sat down heavily in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Your grandfather warned you about that. Never answer if something calls your name in the woods." Mason nodded, still shaking. "I know. I'm sorry. I wanted it to be him." His mother reached out and took his hand. "I know, honey. I know. But your grandfather would not be down in those woods calling for you. When he passed, he went on to whatever comes next. Whatever that was out there, it was not him. It was something else, something that knew his voice well enough to copy it, well enough to almost fool you." Mason never went into the deep parts of those woods again. He still hiked the family land, but only on the well-maintained trails, and only during full daylight. He never stayed out past sunset, and he never, ever answered when he heard his name called from the trees. Because sometimes, late in the evening, when the shadows grow long, he still hears it. A voice that sounds almost like his grandfather calling from the hollow, inviting him to come down and see something special. But Mason knows better now. He knows the old rules exist for a reason. The woods know your name. They have been listening to the people who walk among the trees for generations, learning their voices, learning how to call them. But whatever calls you from the darkness, whatever mimics the voices of the people you love, it is not your friend. It is not trying to show you something wonderful. It is hungry, and it is patient, and it will wait in those deep hollows for as long as it takes for someone to be foolish enough to answer when it calls. Noah had always been fascinated by history, particularly the industrial history of Appalachia. While his friends in high school were interested in sports and parties, Noah spent his weekends exploring abandoned buildings, documenting forgotten places with his camera. By the time he turned 19, he had photographed dozens of old churches, schoolhouses, and factories scattered throughout eastern Kentucky. But what really captured his imagination were the coal mines. The mountains were riddled with them. Thousands of mines, some large commercial operations, others small family digs that had been worked for a few years and then abandoned. Most were sealed up now, concrete blocks or steel gates preventing access. But Noah had heard rumors about mines that were still open, still accessible to those who knew where to look. He wanted to document these places before they collapsed entirely, before all evidence of the people who had worked and died in them disappeared forever. His younger brother Marcus was less enthusiastic about these expeditions, but he usually came along anyway. Marcus was 17, more practical than Noah, more concerned with college applications and his part-time job at the hardware store. But he loved his brother, and he figured someone needed to make sure Noah did not get himself killed crawling around dangerous structures. It was Marcus who first heard about the mine near Harlan. They were having lunch at a local diner when an older man at the next table overheard them talking about their photography project. The man leaned over and said he knew of a mine that might interest them. It was off the main roads, up a hollow that most people had forgotten about. The mine had been worked by a single family back in the 1930s, never officially registered, never on any maps. The entrance was still open, he said, though he would not recommend going inside. Noah's eyes lit up. This was exactly the kind of place he wanted to document. He asked the man for directions, and after some hesitation, the old man described how to find it. As they were leaving, the man called after them. "If you boys do go up there, do not stay long. That place has a bad feeling about it. Always has." Noah thanked him and promised they would be careful. 2 days later, on a Saturday morning in March, Noah and Marcus drove out to find the mine. The directions took them down a series of increasingly rough roads until they were on what was barely more than a dirt track winding up a narrow hollow. They parked at the end of the drivable section and hiked the rest of the way on foot, following an overgrown path that showed evidence of use, though it was impossible to tell how recent. The mine entrance appeared after about a half-mile of hiking. It was set into the hillside, a dark opening maybe 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, surrounded by old timbers that were somehow still standing after 90 years. What immediately caught Noah's attention were the symbols carved into the timbers and the rocks around the entrance. They were not decorative. They were crude, angular marks that looked almost like letters, but were not any alphabet Noah recognized. Some were burned into the wood, others scratched deep into the stone. "That is weird," Marcus said, running his fingers over one of the carved symbols. "Why would miners do that?" Noah shook his head. "I do not know. Maybe some kind of identification system, or warnings about structural problems." But even as he said it, he did not believe it. The symbols had a deliberate quality to them, an intentionality that suggested meaning beyond simple markers. They stood at the entrance for a few minutes, letting their eyes adjust to the darkness inside. The opening was not sealed, though someone had at some point nailed boards across it. Those boards were now broken and pulled aside, the nails rusty and bent. The disturbed dirt and the relatively fresh scratches on the boards suggested someone had been here recently. Noah pulled out his high-powered flashlight and shone it into the tunnel. The passage went straight back for about 20 feet before opening into what looked like a larger chamber. The air that came from the opening was cold and stale, carrying a smell that made Marcus wrinkle his nose. "What is that smell?" Noah sniffed. "Sulfur, I think. Sometimes you get that in old mines. Pyrite oxidizing creates sulfur dioxide." Marcus did not look convinced. "That smell is not right, Noah. Maybe we should not go in there." But Noah was already checking his equipment. He had brought 2 flashlights, his camera, and a coil of bright orange paracord that they could use to mark their path. "We will be fine," he said. "We will just go in far enough to get some photos, document what is there, and come right back out. 15 minutes tops." Marcus sighed, but pulled out his own flashlight. "Fine, but if anything seems dangerous, we leave immediately. Deal?" Noah agreed. They entered the mine, moving slowly, testing each step before putting their full weight down. The floor was a mix of packed earth and broken rock, stable enough, but littered with debris. Noah tied one end of the paracord to a timber at the entrance and played it out behind them as they walked. The passage was cramped, the ceiling low enough that they had to hunch slightly. Their flashlight beams cut through the darkness, illuminating support timbers, tool marks on the walls, and the occasional rusted piece of equipment. The tunnel opened into a larger room, maybe 15 feet across. Noah swept his light around, taking it all in. This appeared to be a rest area or staging point. There were remnants of old furniture, a broken chair, wooden crates rotting in the corner, and then his light fell on something that made both brothers freeze. In the far corner of the room, arranged against the wall, were sleeping bags. 2 of them, relatively modern, the kind you could buy at any sporting goods store. Next to them were supplies, bottles of water, cans of food, a camping stove. Someone had been living here. Recently. "Noah," Marcus whispered, his voice tight with fear. "We need to leave, right now." But Noah was already moving closer, his curiosity overriding his caution. He knelt next to the sleeping bags and touched one. His hand came away covered in thick dust. That did not make sense. The sleeping bags looked new, no more than a few years old, but the dust covering them was thick, the kind of accumulation that took decades. He picked up one of the water bottles. The label was faded but readable, a brand that was still sold in stores. But when he turned it, the plastic crumbled in his hands, disintegrating like it had been there for 50 years. "This does not make sense," Noah said, more to himself than to Marcus. "None of this makes sense." "I do not care if it makes sense," Marcus said, backing toward the tunnel. "Something is very wrong here. We are leaving." Noah stood up, ready to agree, when he noticed another passage leading off from the room. It was smaller, more of a crawl space than a proper tunnel. "Wait," he said. "Let me just check what is down there. It will only take a second." Marcus grabbed his arm. "No, we are going now." But Noah shook him off and moved toward the small passage. "Just one quick look. I need to see if there are more symbols, more evidence of what this place was used for." Before Marcus could stop him, Noah dropped to his hands and knees and crawled into the smaller tunnel. Marcus stood in the main chamber, his flashlight beam dancing nervously around the space. "Noah, come on. This is not funny." Silence. "Noah?" No response. Marcus moved to the entrance of the small tunnel and shone his light down it. The passage went back about 15 feet and then appeared to open into another chamber. He could see the glow of Noah's flashlight moving around in there. "Noah, answer me." He waited. 10 seconds. 20. 30. The glow of Noah's flashlight was still visible, still moving, but his brother was not responding. Fear turned to panic. Marcus dropped to his knees and crawled into the passage, cursing his brother with every movement. The walls were close, pressing in on both sides, and he had to fight the urge to simply back out and run for the surface. He emerged into a small circular chamber, maybe 8 feet across. His flashlight beams swept the space. Empty. Completely empty. No Noah. No other passages. Just bare rock walls, floor, and ceiling. "Noah!" Marcus screamed, his voice echoing in the confined space. Nothing. On the floor, in the center of the chamber, was Noah's flashlight. Still on, lying on its side, casting strange shadows on the walls. Next to it was his camera. The lens was cracked, a spiderweb pattern spreading across the glass. But there was no sign of his brother. No body, no blood, no evidence of a struggle. Noah had simply vanished. Marcus grabbed the camera and the flashlight and scrambled backward out of the chamber. He did not remember the crawl back through the small tunnel. He did not remember running through the main room. The next thing he knew, he was outside in the daylight, gasping for air, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold on to Noah's equipment. He ran down the trail to their car and called 911. The call went through, barely. He tried to explain what had happened, where they were, that his brother had disappeared inside a mine. The dispatcher told him to stay where he was, that help was coming. The search and rescue team arrived within an hour. Marcus led them back to the mine entrance, though every instinct he had screamed at him to never go near that place again. The team went inside with professional equipment, radios, and mapping tools. They searched for 6 hours. They explored every inch of that mine, including the small chamber where Noah had vanished. They found nothing. No sign of Noah, no hidden passages, no collapsed sections that could have trapped him. The chamber Marcus described was exactly as he said, a dead end with no other exits. It was impossible for anyone to have disappeared from that space. But Noah was gone. The rescue team brought out Noah's flashlight and camera, which Marcus had dropped in his panic. They also brought out something else, the sleeping bags and supplies from the main chamber. When they were examined in daylight, they fell apart. The sleeping bags disintegrated into threads. The food cans were so corroded they crumbled at a touch. Everything was ancient, decades old, despite looking modern in the darkness of the mine. The authorities sealed the mine entrance with concrete, posting it as a hazard. Marcus gave a statement to the police, to the searchers, to anyone who would listen. But there was nothing they could do. Noah had vanished into solid rock, into a space with no exits, leaving behind only his broken camera and a mystery that would never be solved. Marcus kept Noah's camera. Sometimes, late at night, he looks at the last photos Noah took. Most are blurry, unfocused images of rock walls and darkness. But the final photo, the one taken just before the lens cracked, shows something that makes Marcus's blood run cold. It is a picture of the chamber, the small circular room, and standing against the far wall, barely visible in the shadows, are figures. Tall, thin, watching, and in front of them, already starting to turn translucent, already starting to fade, is Noah. Liam had been looking forward to this trip for months, ever since his friend Tyler mentioned that his uncle owned a hunting cabin in the North Carolina mountains and that they could use it for opening weekend of deer season. Liam had been counting down the days. He had grown up hunting with his father in the flatlands of eastern North Carolina, but he had always wanted to experience mountain hunting, where the terrain was challenging and the forests were thick with old-growth timber. Tyler had invited 3 other friends along. There was Chris, who worked construction and could fix anything, Marcus, who was the best shot among them, and Devin, who was new to hunting but enthusiastic to learn. The 5 of them loaded up Tyler's truck with gear, supplies, and enough food and beer for a long weekend in the woods. They left on a Thursday afternoon in November, driving west as the land gradually rose into the Appalachian foothills and then into the mountains proper. Tyler's uncle had given him detailed directions to the cabin, along with a key and a warning to make sure they locked everything up tight when they left. The cabin was isolated, Tyler explained. His uncle only used it a few times a year, and it had been broken into before. Nothing major stolen, just the inconvenience of having to replace a window or repair a door. The isolation was part of the appeal, though. They would have thousands of acres of national forest to hunt, with the nearest neighbor being several miles away. They turned off the main highway onto a Forest Service road, and then from that road onto an even smaller track that wound through dense woods. The truck bounced over rocks and roots, and branches scraped against the sides. After 30 minutes of slow, careful driving, they emerged into a clearing where the cabin sat. It was larger than Liam had expected. 2 stories, built from logs that had darkened with age, with a wide porch across the front and a stone chimney rising from one end. Solar panels on the roof provided some electricity, and Tyler said there was a well for water and a propane system for heat and cooking. It was rustic, but comfortable. Exactly what Liam had been hoping for. They unloaded the truck as the sun began to set, carrying their gear inside. The interior was open and simple. A large main room with a kitchen area on one side. A living space with old furniture arranged around a wood stove on the other. A steep staircase led to a loft where there were several beds. Everything smelled of wood smoke and old fabric, the scent of a place that was only occasionally used. Tyler got the propane heater running while Chris started a fire in the wood stove. They cooked dinner, drank a few beers, and talked about their hunting strategy for the morning. The plan was to wake before dawn, spread out across different sections of the surrounding forest, and meet back at the cabin by noon to compare notes. Everyone was in good spirits, excited for the morning, tired from the long drive. It was Devin who first mentioned the basement. He had been exploring the cabin, opening doors and closets, getting familiar with the layout. "Hey, Tyler," he called from the kitchen area. "Did your uncle say anything about what is in the basement?" Tyler looked up from the map he was studying. "Basement? I did not think there was one." Devin pointed to a door near the back of the kitchen. "Well, there is a door here with a deadbolt. I figured it was the basement." Tyler walked over and examined the door. It was solid wood, older than the rest of the cabin's interior, and it did indeed have a heavy deadbolt installed on the outside. "That is weird," Tyler said. "Why would you put a lock on the outside of a basement door?" He tried the knob, but it was locked. "My uncle did not give me a key for this. I did not even know it was here." Chris came over to look. "You want me to pop the lock? I've got tools in the truck." Tyler hesitated. "I do not know, man. If it is locked, maybe it is locked for a reason. Could be structural problems down there, or maybe he is storing something he does not want people messing with." But the group was curious now, and after a few minutes of discussion, Tyler agreed to let Chris open the door. "Just to take a quick look," he said. "Make sure there is nothing weird, like a gas leak or water damage." Chris went to the truck and came back with a pry bar. The deadbolt was old, and the screws were rusted. It took him less than 2 minutes to pop it off. Tyler opened the door, and they all peered down into the darkness below. A set of rough wooden stairs descended into blackness. The smell that came up from below was unpleasant, musty, and damp, with an undertone of something organic and rotting. Liam grabbed a flashlight and shone it down the stairs. The beam revealed a dirt floor at the bottom, maybe 12 feet down. "It is just a root cellar or something," Marcus said. "Old cabins like this usually have them for storage." Tyler started down the stairs, testing each step before putting his weight on it. The others followed. The basement was larger than Liam expected, running under most of the cabin's footprint. The ceiling was low, supported by thick wooden posts. The walls were exposed stone and earth, with moisture seeping through in places. Old shelves lined one wall, empty except for a few broken mason jars and rusted cans. It looked exactly like what Marcus had suggested, a storage cellar that had not been used in decades. But then Liam's flashlight beam swept across the far corner, and everyone fell silent. Against the wall was a section that had clearly been modified. A heavy chain was bolted to the stone, its links thick and corroded with rust. Next to it, another chain, and another. 5 chains in total, each about 6 feet long, each ending in a heavy manacle. On the floor, near the chains, was a stained mattress, the fabric rotted and torn, dark stains soaking through the material. "What the hell is this?" Devin whispered, his voice shaking. Chris moved closer, shining his light on the chains. The bolts securing them to the wall were sunk deep into the stone, professionally installed, meant to hold serious weight. This was not something temporary or makeshift. This was deliberate, built to restrain. Liam's light found something else. Scattered on the floor near the mattress were personal items. A woman's shoe, a bracelet, tarnished silver with a broken clasp. A wallet, the leather cracked and moldy. He bent down and carefully opened the wallet with the edge of his flashlight. Inside was a driver's license. The photo faded but still visible. A young woman, maybe mid-20s, smiling at the camera. The license was from South Carolina, issued in 2003. "We need to get out of here," Marcus said, his voice tight. "We need to call the police right now." Tyler was already backing toward the stairs. "There is no cell service here. We will have to drive out to the main road." But Chris was exploring further, his light revealing more items. Another wallet, this one with a Tennessee license from 2007. A third wallet, Georgia, 2005. A small jewelry box containing rings, necklaces, earrings. All women's jewelry. All different styles. Liam felt sick. This was not storage. This was not some weird artifact from the cabin's past. This was a crime scene. Multiple crime scenes. The chains, the mattress, the personal items from different women across different years. Someone had used this basement as a prison, as a torture chamber, and Tyler's uncle owned this property. "Tyler," Liam said carefully, "how well do you know your uncle?" Tyler's face had gone white. "He is my mother's brother. I've known him my whole life. He is weird, kind of a loner, but he could not. His voice trailed off as the implication settled over him like a physical weight. Devin was the first to hear it. He held up his hand, silencing everyone. "Listen," he hissed. They all froze. From outside, somewhere in the darkness beyond the cabin, came the sound of a vehicle, an engine getting closer, the crunch of tires on the gravel track leading to the clearing. Pure terror hit the group. Someone was coming. At night. To this isolated cabin. After they had just discovered what was hidden in the basement. Chris moved first. "Everybody upstairs. Now." They scrambled up the wooden stairs, Liam nearly falling in his haste. Tyler grabbed the deadbolt that Chris had removed and tried to screw it back into place with shaking hands, but the wood was splintered. It would not hold. The engine sound grew louder, then stopped. A truck door slammed, footsteps on the porch. The group stood in the main room, frozen, as the front door handle rattled. Then a knock, loud and authoritative. "Tyler, you in there?" "It is Uncle Ray." Tyler looked at his friends, his face a mask of panic and confusion. "What do I do?" Chris pointed toward the back of the cabin. "There is a window in the kitchen. We go out that way, get to our truck, and drive the hell out of here." But Marcus shook his head. "He will hear us. His truck is right there. He will see us." Another knock, harder this time. "Tyler, I know you are in there. I saw your truck open up." Tyler's hands were shaking. Maybe it is not him. Maybe he does not know about the basement. Maybe someone else. "Tyler," Liam interrupted, his voice steady despite the fear. "There is a deadbolt on the outside of that basement door. Think about that. The only reason to lock it from the outside is to keep something in." The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then they heard footsteps moving around the porch, circling the cabin. Ray was checking the windows, looking for a way in, or looking to see if they were preparing to run. Liam made a decision. He walked to the gun rack where they had stored their hunting rifles. "We are not running," he said quietly. "We are staying right here, and we are armed, and we are calling for help the second we can get to a phone." The others quickly followed suit, each grabbing their weapon, checking that it was loaded. The footsteps stopped at the front door again. Ray's voice came through the wood, and this time the friendly tone was gone. "I'm going to give you boys one chance to walk out of here. Get in your truck and go. Forget you were ever here. I will know if you went downstairs, but if you leave now, we can all pretend this never happened." Tyler's voice cracked as he called back. "We already called the police. They're on their way." It was a lie, but a necessary one. Silence from outside. Then Ray's voice, colder now. "No, you did not. There is no cell service for 15 miles, and the only way out is past my truck." What followed were the longest hours of Liam's life. Ray circled the cabin throughout the night, occasionally calling out to them, sometimes friendly and cajoling, sometimes threatening. He tried windows, tried to force the doors, even attempted to climb to the second-floor loft. But the cabin was solid, built to withstand harsh mountain winters, and the 5 friends inside kept their weapons trained on every possible entrance. At one point, around 3 in the morning, they heard Ray's truck start up. They watched from the windows as his headlights receded down the track. They waited 30 minutes, making sure he was really gone, before they piled into Tyler's truck and drove out themselves. They did not stop until they reached the sheriff's station in the nearest town, arriving just as the sun was rising. The investigation that followed revealed horrors that made the news across the entire Southeast. Ray Henson was arrested within hours, though he denied everything. The items from the basement were processed as evidence. DNA from the mattress matched 3 missing women from across multiple states, all hikers who had vanished from Appalachian trails between 2003 and 2011. The identifications in the wallets matched. More evidence was found on the property, buried in the woods surrounding the cabin. Ray Henson was convicted of multiple counts of kidnapping and murder. He is currently serving life without parole. The cabin was seized by the state and later demolished. The land remains undeveloped, a dark piece of forest that locals avoid. Tyler never spoke to his family again. The guilt of being related to such evil, even unknowingly, was too much. The 5 friends stayed in touch for a while, but eventually drifted apart. Some experiences are too dark to share indefinitely. The weight of them pulls relationships apart over time. Liam still thinks about that night, about the chains bolted into stone, about the women who had been held in that darkness, hoping for rescue that came too late or never came at all, about how close they had come to being silenced themselves. The mountains had kept Ray Henson's secret for nearly a decade. His sanctuary, isolated and perfect, had become a tomb for the innocent. Some monsters do not lurk in caves or abandoned mines. Some monsters build cabins in beautiful clearings surrounded by pristine forest. And they wait there, patient and hidden, until the next victim wanders close enough to catch. Jacob considered himself an experienced outdoorsman. By the time he turned 28, he had completed multiple sections of the Appalachian Trail, had spent countless nights camping in remote wilderness areas, and had developed the kind of confidence that comes from knowing how to handle yourself in the backcountry. He knew how to navigate by compass and stars, how to find water, how to build a shelter in an emergency. He had encountered bears, gotten lost in fog, weathered sudden storms. Nothing in the woods particularly frightened him anymore. That confidence was why he decided to do a solo overnight trip in the Great Smoky Mountains in late October. The park would be mostly empty, the summer tourists long gone, the fall colors fading to brown. He wanted solitude, wanted to test his skills, wanted to spend a night completely alone in one of the most pristine wilderness areas in the eastern United States. He picked a remote section of backcountry, obtained his permit, and headed out on a Friday afternoon with his pack and his tent and nothing else but his own thoughts. The hike in took about 4 hours, following an old trail that climbed steadily up a ridge. The forest was beautiful in that stark way that autumn brings. The leaves mostly fallen, the branches bare, giving long views through the trees. Jacob saw no other hikers, which was exactly what he wanted. By the time he reached his chosen campsite, a flat area near a small creek about 2 miles from the nearest trail junction, the sun was beginning to set. He went through his routine with practiced efficiency. Set up the tent, gather firewood, filter water from the creek, hang his food bag high in a tree away from camp to prevent bear problems. He built a small fire as darkness fell, heated water for a dehydrated meal, and sat on a log watching the flames dance. The temperature was dropping quickly, probably down into the 30s. Cold enough to see his breath, but not dangerously cold if you had proper gear. The night was incredibly quiet. There was no wind, no sound of distant traffic or aircraft, just the crackle of his fire and the occasional hoot of an owl somewhere in the trees above. Jacob felt completely at peace. This was why he came to the mountains. This silence, this solitude, this feeling of being utterly disconnected from the modern world. He let his fire burn down to coals around 9 o'clock and crawled into his tent. His sleeping bag was rated for 20 degrees, and he was wearing thermal layers. He was comfortable, warm, ready for a good night's sleep, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that only comes after a day of hard hiking in clean mountain air. He woke to the sound of whistling. At first, still half asleep, his mind tried to rationalize it. Another camper, maybe, despite the remoteness of his location. Someone hiking at night with a headlamp, whistling to keep their spirits up. But as full consciousness returned, Jacob realized several things that made his skin prickle. First, the whistling was not coming from the trail. It was coming from the forest, off in the trees. Second, it was not a random tune. It was a melody, complex and rhythmic, with a pattern that seemed almost deliberately structured. And third, it was circling his camp. Jacob unzipped his sleeping bag and sat up, listening intently. The whistling moved from his left to directly in front of his tent, then to his right, then behind him. It was methodical, maintaining a constant distance of maybe 30 or 40 yards, never stopping, never pausing for breath. Just an endless warbling melody moving through the darkness around him. He checked his watch, 2:17 in the morning. He grabbed his flashlight and unzipped his tent, shining the beam out into the forest. The whistling continued, unaffected by the light. He could not see anything but trees and shadows. "Hello?" Jacob called out, his voice sounding small and uncertain. "Is someone there?" The whistling did not stop, did not acknowledge his voice in any way. It just continued its circuit around his camp. Jacob felt his pulse quicken. There was something profoundly wrong about this. Humans did not move through dense forest in complete darkness while whistling continuously. It was not natural. It was not right. He thought about the old Appalachian warnings he had heard over the years, the folklore that most people dismissed as superstition. If you hear whistling at night in the woods, no, you did not. Do not acknowledge it. Do not follow it. Do not answer it. But this was not folklore. This was real. Something was circling his camp, and it had been doing so long enough to wake him from deep sleep. Jacob made a decision. He quickly got dressed, putting on his boots and jacket over his thermal layers. He built up his fire, adding every piece of wood he had collected, creating a blaze that pushed back the darkness in a wide circle around his tent. The whistling continued, but it seemed to pause when the fire flared up. For just a moment, there was silence. Then it resumed, still circling, but maybe slightly farther away. Jacob sat close to the fire, his back to a large tree, his flashlight in one hand and his knife in the other. Not that a knife would do any good against whatever this was, but holding it made him feel slightly less helpless. He swept his flashlight beam slowly around the perimeter of his camp, watching the tree line. And that was when he saw them. Two eyes, reflecting back the light, glowing with that distinctive eye shine that indicates a living creature. But they were high, impossibly high, at least 8 or 9 feet off the ground. No deer had eyes that high. No bear stood that tall. Jacob kept his light on the eyes, and they did not move. They just stared back at him, unblinking, while the whistling continued from that exact direction. The sound was coming from whatever was standing there in the darkness, watching him. And now that he was focused on it, Jacob realized the whistling had changed. It was getting more complex, adding harmonics, adding layers. It sounded less like one source and more like multiple whistles overlapping, creating an eerie, discordant melody. "Go away," Jacob said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Leave me alone." The whistling intensified, growing louder. The eyes did not move. Jacob added more wood to his fire, determined to keep it burning as bright as possible. The flames leaped higher, crackling and popping, and the eyes finally shifted. Whatever it was moved slightly to the side, still at the edge of the firelight, still watching. Hours passed, the longest hours of Jacob's life. The whistling never stopped. It circled and circled, sometimes at the edge of the firelight, sometimes farther back in the trees. The eyes appeared in different locations, always at that impossible height, always staring. Jacob burned through all his firewood and then started breaking branches from the surrounding deadfall, never letting the fire diminish. His mind raced through possibilities. Bear, but bears did not whistle. Person, but no person could move like that or produce that sound. Mountain lion, but the eyes were wrong, and the behavior was all wrong. Unknown animal, something science had not yet documented. But even as he tried to rationalize it, he knew he was lying to himself. This was not an animal. This was something else. Around 5:30 in the morning, the sky began to lighten in the east. The absolute blackness of the forest slowly gave way to gray pre-dawn light. And with the first hint of sunrise, the whistling stopped. Abruptly mid-note, it simply ceased. Jacob swept his flashlight around the perimeter one more time. The eyes were gone. The presence, whatever it had been, was gone. Jacob did not wait for full daylight. He broke camp faster than he had ever broken camp in his life, stuffing gear into his pack without bothering to organize anything, kicking dirt over his fire, collapsing his tent, and rolling it up still damp with dew. He was hiking within 15 minutes, moving fast down the trail toward the trailhead, looking over his shoulder every few steps. The hike out took 3 hours instead of the 4 it had taken to hike in. Jacob practically ran the last mile, only slowing when he saw the parking area ahead, when he saw his truck exactly where he had left it, when he knew he was back in civilization. He threw his pack in the bed of the truck, climbed into the cab, locked the doors, and sat there for 10 minutes, hands shaking on the steering wheel, before he could trust himself to drive. He drove straight to a diner in the nearest town and ordered coffee and breakfast. The normalcy of it, the bright lights, and the chatter of other customers, and the smell of bacon, helped ground him back in reality. But his hand still shook as he held his coffee cup. The waitress noticed. She was an older woman, probably in her 60s, with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a bun. "You okay, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jacob tried to smile. "Just had a rough night camping." She refilled his coffee and leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "You were up in the Smokies?" He nodded. She glanced around, then said quietly, "You hear anything strange up there? Any whistling?" Jacob's head snapped up. "How did you know?" The waitress straightened, her expression serious. "Because you are not the first person to come down from those mountains looking like that. My daddy used to guide hunts up there back in the 50s and 60s. He told me stories about the Whistler. Said it has been in those mountains longer than anyone can remember. Said the Cherokee had stories about it. Warnings about going into the deep woods alone at night." "What is it?" Jacob asked. The waitress shook her head. "Daddy never knew. He saw it once, just the outline of something tall moving between trees, whistling that same tune. He said it did not mean to hurt people directly. It meant to lure them, to get them to follow the sound deeper into the forest, away from safety, till they were lost and exhausted and vulnerable. Then..." She did not finish the sentence. Jacob felt cold despite the warmth of the diner. "What do you do if you hear it?" The waitress met his eyes. "You do exactly what you did. Build up a fire, stay put, wait for dawn. Fire is the only thing that keeps it at bay. It will not cross flames, and it cannot move in sunlight." Jacob finished his breakfast in silence and left a large tip. As he drove back toward home, back toward his normal life, he made a decision. He would never camp alone in the Smokies again. He would never hike at night. And if he ever heard whistling in the forest, he would remember the old rule. If you hear whistling at night in the woods, know you did not, because the mountains are old, older than human settlement, older than recorded history. And in those ancient forests, things exist that have no name, no classification, no explanation. Things that whistle in the darkness, circling campfires, waiting patiently for the flames to die down or for foolish souls to wander beyond the light. Jacob knows the truth now. The woods are not empty. They are not silent. And they are not safe. Not at night. Not when something is whistling. Lucas had been hiking the Appalachian trail sections in Virginia for 3 years, methodically working his way through the state one segment at a time. He was not attempting a through hike, the grueling journey from Georgia to Maine that takes most people 5 to 6 months. He had a job, responsibilities, a life that did not allow for that kind of extended adventure, but he could manage weekend trips, and over time those weekends added up. He was 25 years old, worked as a software engineer in Richmond, and found that the trail gave him something his desk job could not: a sense of accomplishment, a connection to the natural world, a way to clear his mind of code and deadlines and the artificial glow of computer screens. His co-workers thought he was crazy to spend his weekend sweating up mountains, but Lucas did not care. The trail had become essential to his mental health. On a Saturday in early September, Lucas drove out to a trailhead near the George Washington National Forest. The plan was simple: a 12-mile day hike on a well-maintained section of trail, a route he had researched thoroughly. The weather forecast was clear. The trail was popular enough that he would see other hikers, and he had all the gear he needed. His girlfriend Emily knew exactly where he was going and when to expect him back. It was supposed to be routine. The hike started perfectly. Lucas hit the trail around 8 in the morning, the air still cool from the night before, morning mist hanging in the valleys. The trail climbed steadily through mixed hardwood forest, the path clear and well marked with the familiar white blazes that guided AT hikers. He passed several other hikers in the first hour, exchanging nods and brief greetings. Everything was exactly as it should be. Around 11 o'clock, Lucas stopped for lunch at a rocky outcrop that offered views over the valley below. He ate his sandwich, drank some water, checked his GPS watch. He was making good time, right on schedule. After a 20-minute break, he shouldered his pack and continued north along the trail. That was when the fog rolled in. It came quickly, unnaturally quickly. One moment, Lucas could see 100 yards ahead on the trail, and the next moment the world had contracted to a gray bubble maybe 10 feet in diameter. The fog was thick, wet, clinging to his skin and clothes. He stopped walking and pulled out his map and compass. Fog was not uncommon in the mountains, and he knew how to navigate in low visibility. He was not worried. But when he checked his compass, something was wrong. The needle was spinning, rotating slowly in circles, never settling on any particular direction. Lucas tapped the compass, thinking maybe there was an air bubble or it had gotten damaged. The needle continued to spin. He pulled out his phone to check the GPS app. No signal. That was not unusual in the mountains, but his GPS should still work offline. He opened the app. It was frozen, the location markers spinning endlessly, trying to acquire a position and failing. Lucas felt the first stirring of unease. He was on a well-marked trail. Even in fog, he should be able to follow the white blazes painted on trees every 50 yards or so. He moved forward slowly, watching for the next blaze. He walked for what felt like 5 minutes without seeing one. He stopped, turned around, walked back the way he had come. No blazes. The trail itself seemed less defined now, the clear path fading into general forest floor. He pulled out his whistle, the emergency signal device every hiker carries, and blew 3 sharp blasts. The sound was immediately swallowed by the fog, muffled and flat, like the air itself was absorbing it. No response came. Lucas stood still, listening. The forest was absolutely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind moving through the trees. Just the fog and the silence pressing in from all sides. Lucas made a decision. He would stay put. Every survival guide says the same thing. If you are lost, stop moving. You will only get more lost. Stay where you are. Make yourself visible. Wait for help. He found a relatively flat spot and sat down on his pack, pulling out his emergency blanket. He wrapped it around his shoulders, the reflective material helping retain body heat and also making him more visible. He checked his watch. 12:15. He would wait here, periodically blowing his whistle until the fog cleared or until other hikers came by. The trail was popular. Someone would come along eventually. He just had to be patient. Lucas closed his eyes, taking deep breaths, trying to calm the anxiety that was building in his chest. The silence was oppressive, unnatural. He had been in forests before in fog, but there were always sounds. Water dripping from leaves, his own breathing, something. This was different. He opened his eyes. The fog seemed darker now, thicker. He checked his watch again to see how long he had been sitting. The display showed 11:47 p.m. Lucas stared at the watch face, not understanding what he was seeing. 11:47 at night. That was impossible. It had been 12:15 in the afternoon. He looked around wildly. It was dark, not foggy day dim, but actual night dark. How had that happened? Lucas fumbled for his headlamp with shaking hands and switched it on. The beam cut through the fog, revealing trees around him. But they were not the same trees. He was not sitting on the trail anymore. He was in the middle of a section of forest he did not recognize, surrounded by thick undergrowth and fallen logs. He stood up quickly, his pack falling backward, the emergency blanket sliding off his shoulders. He spun in a circle, the headlamp beam dancing across unfamiliar terrain. Where was he? How did he get here? And what had happened to the last 11 hours? He had closed his eyes when it was just after noon, and now it was nearly midnight. That was impossible. People did not just lose 11 hours. He checked his watch again, thinking maybe it had malfunctioned. 11:51 p.m. The seconds were ticking normally. The date was correct. Saturday, September 14th. Lucas looked down at himself in the headlamp light and felt his panic intensify. His boots were covered in mud, thick clay-like mud that went up past his ankles. His pants were torn in several places, the fabric shredded, as if he had been pushing through heavy briars. His hands had scratches on them, thin lines of dried blood crossing his palms and the backs of his fingers. He touched his face and felt more scratches there. And when he looked at his fingers, they came away with small amounts of blood. He had been moving. For 11 hours, he had been moving through the forest, and he had absolutely no memory of it. No memory of walking, no memory of pushing through undergrowth, no memory of getting these injuries. It was as if someone had simply cut that time out of his life, deleted it completely, and deposited him here in this unknown location in the middle of the night. Lucas forced himself to think logically. He needed to find the trail, or a road, or any landmark he recognized. He needed to get out of this forest. He picked up his pack, checked that his emergency gear was still there. Everything was present. Phone still dead, compass still spinning uselessly. He picked a direction that seemed to go slightly downhill and started walking. The forest at night, even with a headlamp, is a disorienting place. Every tree looks the same. Every shadow could hide a drop-off or a fallen log. Lucas moved slowly, carefully, his mind racing with questions he could not answer. What had he been doing for 11 hours? Where had he gone? Why could he not remember any of it? He walked for what felt like hours, checking his watch compulsively. 12:30 a.m., 1:15 a.m. The forest seemed endless, unchanging. He should have hit a road or a trail or a stream, some kind of landmark. Virginia was not that remote. You could not walk for hours in any direction without hitting some sign of civilization. But the forest just continued, trees and undergrowth, and darkness, on and on. At 2:23 in the morning, Lucas saw lights. Not natural lights, but the steady glow of electrical lights. He moved toward them, practically running, branches whipping his face. He burst out of the tree line, onto a paved road, and the sudden transition from forest to asphalt was so abrupt it was almost disorienting. A car was coming, headlights cutting through the darkness. Lucas stumbled into the middle of the road, waving his arms. The car stopped, and a woman in her 50s rolled down her window, her expression concerned and a little frightened. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Lucas could barely form words. "I am lost. I was hiking and I got lost. Where am I?" The woman told him he was on Route 33, near Elkton. Lucas felt his knees go weak. Elkton was more than 20 miles from where he had started his hike. 20 miles of mountainous terrain. There was no way he could have walked that far, especially not in the condition he was in. But here he was. The woman insisted on calling the police. A state trooper arrived within 30 minutes and took Lucas's statement. The trooper was professional, but clearly skeptical. A hiker who lost 11 hours and ended up 20 miles from his starting point with no memory of how he got there. It sounded like a drug experience or a mental health episode, but Lucas was coherent. His pupils were normal, and he clearly had been through some kind of ordeal. The trooper drove Lucas back to the trailhead where his car was parked. The sun was coming up by the time they arrived, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Lucas's car sat alone in the parking area, exactly where he had left it. He thanked the trooper, got in his car, and sat there for a long moment before he felt steady enough to drive. He called Emily from the parking lot. She had been frantic, had already called the park service to report him missing. He tried to explain what had happened, but the words sounded insane even to his own ears. 11 hours gone, 20 miles traveled, no memory, injuries he could not explain. Lucas drove to the hospital in Harrisonburg and demanded a full workup. Blood tests, CT scan, everything. The doctors found nothing. No drugs in his system, no head injury, no sign of stroke or seizure or any medical condition that would explain memory loss. He was physically exhausted and dehydrated, with minor cuts and bruises consistent with moving through dense forest, but otherwise healthy. The weeks that followed were difficult. Lucas could not stop thinking about the missing time, could not stop trying to remember. He underwent hypnotherapy, hoping it might unlock the lost memories. Nothing. It was as if those 11 hours simply did not exist in his mind. The therapist suggested it might be dissociative amnesia triggered by extreme stress, but Lucas did not buy it. He had not been stressed. He had been on a routine hike in good weather on a familiar trail. He returned to the area once, 3 months later, trying to retrace his steps. He found the rocky outcrop where he had eaten lunch. He found the approximate spot where the fog had rolled in, but he could not find any explanation for what had happened to him. The forest kept its secrets. Lucas stopped hiking alone after that. He stopped hiking in Virginia altogether. The mountains had taken something from him, 11 hours of his life that he would never get back. And the not knowing was the worst part. Not knowing where he went, what he saw, what happened during those missing hours. His body had been there, moving through the forest, getting scratched and muddy and exhausted. But his mind had been somewhere else, or something had taken his mind somewhere else. He still has the clothes he wore that day, stored in a plastic bag in his closet. The torn pants, the muddy boots. Sometimes he takes them out and looks at them, searching for clues. The mud is a reddish clay that he has never seen on any trail in Virginia. The tears in the fabric are clean, almost precise, not the random rips you would expect from briars. And when he looked at the boots under ultraviolet light, he found marks. Handprints, visible only under UV covering the leather. Small handprints like a child's, dozens of them. Lucas does not know what those 11 hours contained. He does not know if he wants to know, because some part of him, deep down, believes that his conscious mind protected him by forgetting, that whatever happened in that fog, whatever took him 20 miles through impossible terrain, left him with scratches and mud and strange handprints on his boots, was something his psyche decided he should not remember. The mountains took 6 hours from one man years ago. They took 11 from Lucas, and they gave back nothing but questions that have no answers and a void where his memories should be. Daniel had never met his grandfather. The old man had died when Daniel's father was still young, killed in a logging accident in the mountains of eastern Tennessee back in 1967. But the family had kept the property, a cabin, and 20 surrounding acres deep in the Cherokee National Forest. It had been passed down through the family with the understanding that it would never be sold, that it would remain a place where future generations could connect with their roots. Daniel's father had visited the cabin regularly when Daniel was growing up, sometimes taking Daniel along for weekend trips. But after his father passed away from cancer 3 years ago, Daniel had not been back. Life got busy. Work, relationships, the general chaos of being in your late 20s and trying to figure out where you fit in the world. The cabin became something he thought about occasionally, but never quite made time for. Then the property taxes came due, and Daniel realized he needed to make a decision. Keep the cabin and take responsibility for it, or sell it and let that piece of family history go. He He decided to visit the place one more time before making up his mind. If it was in good shape, maybe he would keep it, use it as a retreat. If it had fallen into disrepair, maybe it was time to let it go. He made the drive from Nashville on a Friday afternoon in October, winding through increasingly rural roads until he reached the Forest Service road that led to the property. The road was worse than he remembered, full of potholes and overgrown with vegetation that scraped the sides of his SUV. Clearly, it had been a while since anyone had driven up here. The cabin appeared through the trees, and Daniel felt a wave of nostalgia. It looked smaller than he remembered from childhood, the way places always do when you return as an adult. But it was still standing, the roof intact, the porch only slightly sagging. He parked in the clearing and sat in his car for a moment, taking it all in. His grandfather had built this place with his own hands in the 1950s. His father had proposed to his mother on that porch. Daniel had caught his first fish in the creek that ran behind the property. He grabbed his overnight bag from the back seat and walked up to the front door. The lockbox was still there, containing the spare key. He opened it and retrieved the key, inserted it into the lock, and pushed the door open. The hinges creaked, but the door swung smoothly. He stepped inside and immediately froze. The cabin was warm. Not just warmer than the outside air, but actually warm, like a heater had been running recently. Daniel stood in the doorway, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. There was a fire in the fireplace, reduced to glowing embers, but still giving off heat. On the kitchen counter were dishes, recently washed and left to dry. A coffee mug sat on the small table, still half full. Someone had been here. Recently. Very recently. Daniel's first thought was that maybe the family had hired a caretaker, someone to check on the place periodically. But no one had mentioned that to him, and he had the only key. The lockbox had been undisturbed, still containing the spare. He walked slowly through the cabin, his heart pounding. In the back bedroom, he found more evidence of occupancy. The bed was made, but there was an indentation in the pillow, like someone had been lying there recently. Clothing was folded on the dresser, men's clothing, not anything Daniel recognized. He opened the closet. More clothing hanging neatly, boots on the floor, personal items, a shaving kit, books, a portable radio. Someone was living here. Someone had made themselves at home in his family's cabin. Daniel pulled out his phone, no signal, which was not surprising given how remote the location was. He would have to drive back out to the main road to call the sheriff. But as he was about to leave, he heard it. A vehicle, somewhere in the distance, getting closer. The sound of an engine laboring up the rough Forest Service road. Panic hit him. Whoever was living here was coming back. Daniel looked around wildly, trying to decide what to do. Hide. Confront them. Leave. Before he could make a decision, he heard the vehicle pull into the clearing, heard the engine cut off, heard a truck door slam. Daniel moved to the window and carefully looked out from behind the curtain. In the clearing, parked next to his SUV, was a beat-up Ford pickup truck, probably from the early 90s, covered in dents and rust. A man was walking toward the cabin, and Daniel's blood ran cold at the sight of him. He was maybe in his 50s, tall and lean, with long graying hair pulled back in a ponytail. His clothes were dirty, worn, practical. But what made Daniel's stomach clench was the way the man moved. There was something predatory about it, something dangerous. And he was staring at Daniel's SUV with an expression that was not surprise or confusion. It was anger. The man reached the porch, and Daniel heard his footsteps on the boards. The front door opened. The man stepped inside, and for a moment, the two men just stared at each other. Then the man spoke, his voice gravelly and cold. "Who the hell are you?" Daniel tried to keep his voice steady. "I am Daniel. This is my family's cabin. My grandfather built it. Who are you?" The man's eyes narrowed. "Your family's cabin. I've been living here for 8 months. This is my home." Daniel felt anger cutting through his fear. "You're squatting on private property. You need to leave, now." The man laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "I am not going anywhere. You are the one who needs to leave. You do not just show up and tell someone to get out of their home." He took a step closer to Daniel, and Daniel instinctively backed up. "This is not your home. This is my property. I can prove it. I have the deed. You are trespassing." The man's expression darkened. "I do not care about your piece of paper. I have been taking care of this place. I fixed the roof, cleared the chimney, kept the pipes from freezing last winter. Where were you? Possession is 9/10 of the law, city boy." Daniel pulled out his phone, showing it to the man even though there was no signal. "I'm calling the sheriff. We can sort this out with them." The man moved fast, faster than Daniel expected. He crossed the room and grabbed Daniel's wrist, squeezing hard enough to make him drop the phone. "You're not calling anyone," the man hissed. "You're going to get in your fancy SUV and drive away, and you're going to forget you were ever here." Daniel tried to pull his arm free, but the man's grip was iron strong. "Let go of me." The man shoved him backward, and Daniel stumbled, catching himself against the wall. "Get out now, while I'm still being nice about it." Daniel saw something in the man's eyes then, something that made survival instinct override everything else. This man was dangerous. This was not going to be resolved with conversation. Daniel needed to leave, needed to get help. He grabbed his bag and moved toward the door, keeping his eyes on the man the whole time. The man watched him with a smile that was more predatory than friendly. Daniel made it to his SUV, jumped in, and started the engine. Only then did he realize the man had followed him outside and was standing on the porch, watching him. As Daniel put the vehicle in reverse, the man called out, "If you come back here, it will not go well for you. This is my place now. Stay away." Daniel drove out as fast as the rough road would allow, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. It took him 45 minutes to reach an area with cell service. He pulled over and immediately called 911, reporting the situation. The dispatcher took his information and said a deputy would meet him at the junction of the Forest Service Road and the main highway. Sheriff's Deputy Collins arrived within 30 minutes, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor. Daniel explained everything, showing her the property deed he had brought with him. She listened, taking notes, then said, "We have been having problems with squatters in the National Forest. People setting up illegal camps, sometimes running drug operations. This is not the first cabin that has been taken over. We will go up there and remove him, but I need you to stay here. If he is violent, we need to handle it properly." 2 more deputies arrived as backup. They drove up to the cabin, and Daniel waited at the junction, checking his watch every few minutes. They were gone for over an hour. When they finally returned, Deputy Collins had a grim expression. He was gone. Cleared out. Took everything. The cabin is empty except for your family's furniture. Daniel felt relief mixed with unease. "Did you find any evidence of who he was? License plate? Anything?" Collins shook her head. "Truck was gone too. We searched the area, found evidence he had been living there for a while, like he said. We also found something else." She paused, and Daniel saw something like concern in her eyes. "Behind the cabin, about 50 yards into the woods, we found a camp. Not his camp, someone else's. Or multiple someone else's. Several tents, supplies, drug paraphernalia. Looks like he was not alone up there. Looks like he had friends." "What does that mean?" Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer made him feel sick. Collins met his eyes. "It means you were very lucky. Men like that, men who are involved in illegal activities in remote areas, they do not like witnesses. They do not like complications. If he had decided you were a threat that needed to be eliminated, you were miles from help, no cell service, no one knowing exactly where you were. You did the right thing by leaving when you did." Daniel gave a full statement and filed a formal trespassing report. The sheriff's office promised to increase patrols in the area and said they would investigate the drug camp they had found. But they were honest with him about the reality. The mountains were vast. People could disappear into the wilderness and avoid law enforcement for months or years. The man who had been living in his cabin was likely long gone by now. That night, staying in a motel in town, Daniel researched squatters' rights and property law. He learned that in some states, someone who occupied property long enough could actually claim legal ownership through adverse possession. 8 months was not long enough, but it was a start. The man had been settling in, establishing residence, possibly planning to claim the cabin as his own eventually. Daniel also did something else. He searched social media and local news for any reports of missing hikers or campers in the Cherokee National Forest over the past year. What he found made his blood run cold. 4 people had gone missing in that area in the past 18 months. 3 hikers, 1 solo camper. None had been found. Search efforts had been called off. The case has gone cold. He thought about the drug camp behind his cabin, about the man's easy violence, about the way he had said, "If you come back here, it will not go well for you." He thought about those missing hikers, wandering into the wrong part of the forest, stumbling across something they were not supposed to see. Daniel made a decision. He would sell the cabin, sell the land, let someone else deal with it. He would take the money and let that piece of family history go. Because some places, no matter how much sentimental value they hold, are not worth dying for. The man had been right about one thing. Daniel did not belong there anymore. The mountains had been claimed by people who had no respect for property lines or family legacies or human life. 2 months later, Daniel sold the property to the National Forest Service for incorporation into the public lands. As part of the sale, he requested that the cabin be demolished. He did not want anyone else staying there, did not want to be responsible if someone else encountered the people who had claimed that section of forest as their territory. The last time Daniel drove past the turnoff to the old Forest Service road, he did not even slow down. He kept his eyes forward and his foot on the gas. Whatever was back there in those woods, it could stay there. His grandfather's cabin, the place where generations of his family had made memories, was gone. But Daniel was alive, and that was what mattered. Not all squatters are desperate homeless people looking for shelter. Some are criminals, hiding from the law, protecting illegal operations, willing to use violence to maintain their claim on a piece of remote wilderness. The mountains give them cover, and isolation gives them power. And if you stumble into their territory, your options are simple. Leave immediately or become another missing person, another unsolved case, another name added to the list of people who walked into the Appalachian forest and never walked back out. Henry hadn't been camping in years. Between work, family obligations, and the general inertia of adult life, outdoor adventures had fallen by the wayside. But his daughter Lily had been begging to go camping for months, ever since her friend Emma had come back from a family camping trip with stories of s'mores and fireflies and sleeping under the stars. So when Henry's wife Sarah suggested they make it happen before summer ended, Henry agreed. They would spend a weekend in Pisgah National Forest in western North Carolina at a designated campground where there would be other families, bathrooms, and relative safety. They arrived on a Friday afternoon in late August, the air thick with humidity, and the forest alive with the drone of cicadas. The campground was more developed than Henry had expected, with paved roads connecting the sites, bear-proof trash containers, and a small ranger station near the entrance. They were assigned Site 17, a spot at the edge of the campground where the forest became denser, and the maintained area gave way to true wilderness. It was perfect. They had enough space that they did not feel crowded by neighboring campers, but close enough to see other families setting up their tents, to hear the laughter of children playing, to feel safe. Henry and Sarah worked together to set up their tent, while Lily explored the immediate area, collecting interesting rocks and sticks. By the time they had camp fully established, the sun was beginning its descent toward the ridgeline. They cooked hot dogs over the fire ring, made s'mores that were more marshmallow than chocolate, and told stories as the darkness deepened around them. Lily was in heaven, her face glowing in the firelight, her excitement palpable. This was exactly what Henry had hoped for, a simple, perfect family moment. Around 8:30, as the fire burned down to comfortable coals and Lily was starting to yawn, They heard it. Children's voices, laughing and playing, coming from the woods beyond their campsite. The sounds were clear. Multiple children, maybe 4 or 5 of them, engaged in some kind of game. Their voices carried through the trees, punctuated by shrieks of laughter and the sound of running footsteps on leaves. Sarah looked at Henry, her expression puzzled. "I thought we were the only family in this section." Henry had thought the same thing. He stood up and looked around the campground. The nearest occupied site was maybe 100 yards away in the opposite direction, and he could see the family there, sitting around their own fire. No children visible. The voices were definitely coming from the forest, from the dark area beyond the maintained campground. "Maybe there is another site back there we did not see," Sarah suggested. But Henry had looked at the campground map when they checked in. Site 17 was the last one in this section. Beyond it was just national forest, unmarked and undeveloped. "I will go check it out," Henry said, grabbing his flashlight. Sarah caught his arm. "Be careful. Do not go too far." Henry nodded and walked toward the tree line, shining his flashlight into the darkness. The children's voices continued, seeming to come from maybe 50 yards into the woods. As he got closer to the forest edge, the sounds became more distinct. He could hear individual voices now, a girl saying something about being it, a boy laughing, the sound of movement through underbrush. "Hello?" Henry called out. "Is there a campsite back there?" The voices stopped immediately. Complete silence, so sudden it was jarring. Henry waited, listening. Nothing. No response, no sound of movement, no resumption of play. Just the normal night sounds of the forest, insects and frogs, and the distant hoot of an owl. He shone his flashlight into the trees, sweeping the beam back and forth. Nothing but trees and shadows. He returned to the campsite, where Sarah and Lily were waiting. "Anything?" Sarah asked. Henry shook his head. "They stopped as soon as I called out. I did not see anyone." Sarah frowned. "That is weird. Why would kids be playing in the woods at night without a flashlight?" Henry did not have an answer. They decided it was probably just sound carrying in strange ways through the forest, maybe from another part of the campground. They put out the fire, got Lily settled in her sleeping bag, and tried to relax. Around 10 o'clock, just as Henry was drifting off to sleep, the voices started again. Closer this time. Right outside their tent, it sounded like. Children laughing, running around the campsite, playing some kind of chase game. Henry unzipped the tent and stuck his head out, flashlight ready. The campsite was empty. The voices stopped the moment he emerged. Sarah sat up, now fully awake. "Henry, what's going on?" He did not know. He walked around the campsite, checking the perimeter. No footprints in the soft dirt around their tent, no disturbed vegetation, no sign that anyone had been there. But he had heard them clear as day. Children, multiple children, running around their tent. They tried to sleep, but every time they were close to drifting off, the voices would start again. Always outside, always close, always stopping the moment Henry or Sarah made any move to investigate. By midnight, they were both exhausted and unnerved. Lily, thankfully, was sleeping soundly, undisturbed by the strange activity. "I am going to walk around, see if I can figure out where this is coming from," Henry said. Sarah did not want him to go alone, so she came with him, leaving Lily in the locked tent with a flashlight beside her sleeping bag. They walked toward the tree line, following the direction the sound seemed to come from. About 40 yards into the forest, Henry's flashlight beam fell on something that made him stop. Metal structures, rusted and covered in vines. He moved closer, pulling back some of the vegetation. It was playground equipment, a swing set, the chains rusted through, the seats long gone. A slide, the metal so corroded it had holes in it. A merry-go-round, frozen in place, the platform warped and dangerous. "What is this doing out here?" Sarah whispered. Henry looked around with his flashlight and found more evidence of human habitation. Concrete foundations, partially hidden under decades of leaf litter. The remains of small buildings, just the floor slabs remaining, vegetation growing through cracks. This had been something, a camp, or a retreat of some kind, long abandoned and reclaimed by the forest. As they stood there, trying to understand what they were seeing, the air grew cold, not gradually but suddenly, like stepping into a refrigerator. Their breath became visible in the flashlight beam. And then they heard it again. Children laughing, but this time they could see where the sound was coming from. The playground equipment, rusted and broken, was moving. The swings were swaying gently, as if invisible children were pumping their legs to go higher. The merry-go-round was rotating slowly, creaking with each revolution, and around the equipment, barely visible in the moonlight that filtered through the trees, were shapes. Translucent, flickering, the suggestion of small bodies running and playing. Henry grabbed Sarah's hand. They stood frozen, watching as the ghostly children continued their game. One of the figures, a small girl with long hair, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned dress, approached the swing set. She climbed onto a swing that was not there anymore, and the chains that were broken began to move as if supporting her weight. She swung higher and higher, and Henry could hear her laughter, clear and bright and terribly sad. Another figure, a boy, turned and looked directly at Henry and Sarah. His face was unclear, features indistinct, but Henry could feel the gaze, could sense the child seeing them. The boy smiled, and the expression was not malicious or frightening. It was just a child's smile, innocent and welcoming. Then all the figures vanished at once, like someone had flipped a switch. The playground equipment stopped moving. The cold dissipated. The forest returned to normal temperature, normal sounds. Henry and Sarah stood in silence for a long moment, not quite believing what they had just witnessed. Then, by unspoken agreement, they turned and walked quickly back to their campsite. They did not sleep the rest of that night. They sat outside their tent, keeping the fire going, watching the tree line. The children's voices did not return. When dawn finally broke, painting the forest in shades of gray and gold, they packed up camp as quickly as possible. Lily woke, confused about why they were leaving so early, but Henry and Sarah did not explain. At the ranger station, as they were checking out, Henry asked the ranger about the old structures in the woods behind Site 17. The ranger, a woman in her 60s with weather-worn skin and kind eyes, nodded slowly. "You found the old camp, then?" Henry waited for her to continue. The ranger sighed. There was a summer camp there, back in the 1960s. Church-run, for kids from the surrounding counties. It operated for about 5 summers. "What happened to it?" Sarah asked, though something in her voice suggested she already knew the answer would not be pleasant. The ranger's expression was somber. "There was an accident in the summer of 1968. A fire in one of the cabins at night. 7 children died. The camp closed after that, never reopened. The Forest Service tried to remove all the structures, but some things were left. The playground equipment, some of the foundations. Too expensive to extract from that remote location." Henry felt his skin prickle. "Do other campers report hearing children's voices?" The ranger met his eyes. "We get reports regularly. Not everyone, but enough. Especially families with children. The rangers have heard them too. Whatever happened here, those children left something behind. An echo, a memory, a presence. We do not talk about it much because we do not want to scare people away, but those of us who work here, we know." "Are they dangerous?" Sarah asked. The ranger shook her head. "No. From what people report, they are just playing, doing what children do. Maybe they do not know they are gone. Maybe this is their eternal summer, where the days are long and there is always a game to play, and nothing bad has happened yet." She paused, then added quietly, "We try to be respectful. We do not develop that area. We let them have their space." Henry and Sarah drove away from Pisgah National Forest in silence. In the back seat, Lily was already asking when they could go camping again. Henry and Sarah exchanged a glance. Maybe when she was older, Henry thought. Maybe when she was old enough to understand that some places hold memories so strong, so filled with emotion, that they imprint themselves on the landscape. The children playing in those woods did not mean to frighten anyone. They were not vengeful spirits or malevolent entities. They were just children who had died too young, whose summer of joy had been cut short by tragedy. And somehow, some part of them remained, replaying those happy moments before the fire, before the screams, before everything ended. Some echoes of joy are strong enough to linger beyond death. And in a clearing in Pisgah National Forest, where rusted playground equipment sits among the trees, children still play in the warm summer nights, laughing and running and swinging on swings that are no longer there. They are not asking to be freed or avenged. They are just being children, the way they were meant to be, forever. Jack had been volunteering with the Appalachian Trail Conservancy for 2 years, spending his weekends maintaining remote sections of the trail that saw little traffic. At 32, he worked a desk job that left him feeling disconnected from anything meaningful, and the trail work gave him purpose. There was something satisfying about clearing fallen trees, repainting blazes, building water bars to prevent erosion. Physical labor that produced visible results. Labor that helped thousands of hikers he would never meet. The work crew he volunteered with was small, usually just 5 or 6 people led by an experienced trail supervisor named Rita. She was in her 50s, had been maintaining trails for over 20 years, and knew the Appalachian Mountains better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. She assigned sections based on difficulty and experience, and Jack had finally earned enough trust to be given a solo project. The section was in a remote area of the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee, about 8 miles from the nearest road. The trail had been reported as overgrown, and several blazes needed repainting. It was a full day's work, but nothing Jack could not handle. Rita gave him the coordinates, the supplies he would need, and a satellite phone in case of emergency. "This area is pretty isolated," she said as she handed him the phone. "Just be aware of your surroundings, keep an eye on the weather, and if anything feels wrong, trust your gut and head back." Jack set out early on a Saturday morning in mid-September, his pack loaded with tools, paint, and lunch. The hike in was beautiful, the forest transitioning from summer green to the first hints of autumn color. He passed a few other hikers in the first few miles, exchanged brief greetings, then had the trail to himself as he moved deeper into the backcountry. He reached his assigned section around 11 in the morning and got to work. The overgrowth was worse than reported. Rhododendron and mountain laurel encroaching on the trail, requiring him to use loppers to cut back the vegetation. It was hard work, and he quickly worked up a sweat despite the cool morning air. By noon, he had cleared about half a mile and stopped for lunch. He was sitting on a fallen log, eating a sandwich and drinking water, when he noticed something odd. About 20 yards off the trail, a tree had a symbol carved into it. Not a trail blaze, but something else. A circle with lines radiating from it, like a crude sun. The carving was deep, cut into the bark with something sharp, and it looked relatively fresh, maybe a few months old. Jack walked over to examine it more closely. The symbol was deliberate, carefully executed, not random vandalism. When he looked around and spotted another marked tree about 30 feet away. This one had a different symbol, a triangle with an X through it. And beyond that, another tree, another symbol. They formed a path leading away from the maintained trail deeper into the forest. His first thought was that someone had created an unauthorized trail, which was a problem. Unmarked trails led to erosion, disturbed wildlife, and lost hikers. He should report it to Rita, but curiosity got the better of him. He wanted to see where the marked trees led, what someone had been trying to find or create out here. He checked his watch. He had time. He could follow the markers for 15 or 20 minutes, document what he found, and report back to Rita with detailed information. Jack began following the carved trees. They led him steadily away from the Appalachian Trail into an area of forest that felt older, darker, the canopy thicker overhead. The symbols changed every few trees, different geometric patterns and shapes, none of which Jack recognized. They were not trail markers he knew. They were not surveying marks. They were something else. After about 10 minutes of walking, the forest opened into a clearing. It was perfectly circular, maybe 40 feet across, and Jack's first impression was that the space felt wrong. The trees surrounding the clearing all leaned slightly inward, as if bowing toward the center. The ground in the clearing was bare earth, nothing growing, not even grass or moss, and in the center, the earth was disturbed. Jack approached cautiously, his sense of curiosity now mixing with unease. The disturbed earth was recent. Someone had been digging here, or maybe covering something up. The dirt was loose, darker than the surrounding soil, mounded slightly in a rough rectangle about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. The dimensions sent a chill down Jack's spine. Those were the dimensions of a grave. He knelt beside the mound, not touching it but examining it closely. There were no obvious signs of what might be buried, no markers, no objects visible. But the more he looked at the clearing, the more wrong it felt. The silence was too complete. No birds, no insects, no sounds at all except his own breathing. And the air had a smell, faint but unpleasant, organic and sweet in a way that made his stomach turn. Jack stood up and looked around the clearing more carefully. At evenly spaced intervals around the perimeter, about every 10 feet, were small objects hung from branches. He walked to the nearest one. It was a bundle of sticks tied together with what looked like twine, forming a crude shape that might have been an animal or might have been human. Other bundles hung around the circle, each slightly different, each made from natural materials, but arranged in ways that were clearly intentional. And then Jack realized he was not alone. The feeling hit him suddenly, a primal awareness that he was being watched. He spun around, scanning the tree line. Nothing visible, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger. Multiple someones, watching from the shadows between the trees. He could not see them, but he could feel their presence, could sense eyes, tracking his every movement. "Hello?" Jack called out, his voice sounding thin and uncertain. No response, just the oppressive silence and the overwhelming sensation of being observed. He took a step backward toward the direction he had come from and heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A voice, or multiple voices whispering. He could not make out words, just a susurrus of sound that seemed to come from all around him. Jack made a decision. He ran. He sprinted back through the forest, following the marked trees in reverse, no longer caring about documentation or understanding what he had found. He just needed to get back to the trail, back to familiar ground, back to safety. Behind him, he heard sounds of pursuit. Not footsteps exactly, but movement, branches breaking, something or several somethings following him. He burst back onto the Appalachian Trail, gasping for breath, his heart hammering in his chest. He looked back toward the marked trees. Nothing was visible, but he could still feel it. That presence, watching from the forest. Jack did not hesitate. He grabbed his pack, abandoned his tools, and the work he had been doing, and started hiking back toward the trailhead as fast as he could move. He did not stop until he reached his truck 2 hours later. His hands were shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. He drove straight to Rita's house, which was near the ranger station, and told her everything. She listened with a grave expression, not interrupting, letting him get the whole story out. When he finished, Rita was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Show me on the map exactly where you found this." Jack pointed to the location on the topographical map, and Rita studied it, her frown deepening. "That area has been off limits before. About 10 years ago, there were reports of illegal activity back there. The Forest Service investigated but never found anything conclusive. They quietly discouraged people from going into that section." "What kind of illegal activity?" Jack asked. Rita met his eyes. "They did not say specifically, but there were rumors. People talking about ritual sites possibly connected to some kind of group that was using remote forest areas for ceremonies. The Forest Service does not like to publicize that kind of thing because it attracts curiosity seekers and can create panic. But there were investigations, federal agents involved, the whole thing. Jack felt sick. The disturbed earth. Rita, it looked like a grave. Rita nodded slowly. I believe you. We need to report this properly. Not to me, not to the Trail Conservancy, to law enforcement. She picked up her phone and called the local sheriff's office, explaining that a volunteer had found something concerning on National Forest land. 2 days later, Jack met with a detective and a National Forest Service law enforcement officer at the ranger station. He walked them through everything he had seen, showed them the location on the map, described the symbols and the clearing and the disturbed earth. They took his statement seriously, asked detailed questions, photographed the symbols he had drawn from memory. A week after that, he received a call from the Forest Service officer. They had investigated the area. They had found the clearing, the marked trees, the disturbed earth. They had brought cadaver dogs. The dogs had alerted. They had excavated, and what they found, the officer said carefully, was evidence of multiple crimes. He could not give Jack details because it was an ongoing investigation, but he could say that Jack's report had potentially solved several missing person cases. The area was cordoned off, officially closed to all access. Jack was told he might need to testify if the investigation led to prosecutions, but for now, he should not discuss what he had found with anyone except law enforcement. The officer thanked him for his diligence and his courage in reporting what he had seen. Jack never went back to that section of the Cherokee National Forest. He continued volunteering with the Trail Conservancy, but he asked to be assigned to different areas, sections closer to roads and established campgrounds. Rita understood without him having to explain. He thinks about that clearing sometimes, especially at night. He thinks about the marked trees leading deeper into the forest, away from safety, away from civilization. He thinks about whoever had carved those symbols, creating a path to their secret place. He thinks about the presence he felt watching him, the whispers, the pursuit. Were they the people responsible for what was buried in that clearing? Or were they something else, guardians or witnesses to darkness that had taken place there? The investigation eventually led to arrests. Jack read about it in the news months later. 3 men charged with multiple counts of kidnapping and murder, their crimes spanning several years. The articles did not mention the clearing, or the marked trees, or the ritual objects. They focused on the victims, on the families finally getting answers, on justice delayed but not denied. But Jack knows the truth. He knows that in the deep Appalachian forest, far from trails and roads, and the eyes of decent people, terrible things happen. And sometimes those terrible things are done by humans who mark their territory, who create their own systems and symbols and sacred spaces, places that should never be sacred, where the earth holds secrets that would be better left buried. The marked trees are still there, leading from the trail to that clearing. The Forest Service left them, evidence in an ongoing case. But they have posted signs now, warning hikers to stay on designated trails, warning that the area is closed for law enforcement activity. Most hikers see the signs and comply, but Jack knows that some will not. Some will be curious, will want to see what is hidden in those woods, and he hopes desperately that whatever was watching him that day is gone now, arrested, or scattered, or frightened away by the investigation. But some part of him doubts it. Some part of him believes that the forest remembers what happened in that clearing, and that the presence he felt watching him was not human at all. It was the forest itself, bearing witness, holding judgment, waiting to see if justice would finally come to that dark and hidden place. The mountains keep many secrets. Some of them have teeth, and some are marked with symbols carved into trees, leading those who are curious or foolish or unlucky into places where civilization has failed and evil has flourished unchecked. Alexander was not the kind of person who took risks. At 29, he was methodical, prepared, the type who checked his tire pressure before every long drive and always kept an emergency kit in his trunk. So when his car broke down on a remote mountain road in eastern Tennessee at 9 o'clock on a November night, it felt like a betrayal of his careful nature. He had been driving back to Knoxville from a weekend visit with his sister in North Carolina, taking the scenic route through the mountains because the interstate was boring and he had time. The route was beautiful during the day, winding through national forest, offering views of ridges and valleys. But at night, it was different. The road was narrow and dark, with no streetlights and few guardrails, just endless trees pressing close on both sides. The car had given no warning. One moment it was running fine, and the next the engine simply died. Alexander coasted to the side of the road, put the car in park, and tried to restart it. Nothing. No turnover, no clicking, nothing. Well, he popped the hood and looked at the engine with his flashlight, but he knew enough about cars to know he was out of his depth. This was not something he could fix with the basic tools in his trunk. He pulled out his phone. No signal. Of course. He was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by mountains that blocked cell towers. He sat in his car for a few minutes, trying to decide what to do. He had not seen another vehicle in over an hour. The chances of someone driving by at this time of night were slim. His options were to wait in the car until morning and hope someone came along, or start walking and try to find help. Alexander decided to walk. He locked his car, pocketed his keys and wallet and phone, grabbed his flashlight, and started hiking along the road in the direction he had been traveling. According to his last GPS reading before he lost signal, there was a small town about 15 miles ahead. If he could find a house or a gas station before that, even better. The night was cold, his breath visible in the flashlight beam. The forest on either side of the road was absolutely black, the trees forming walls of darkness that his light could not penetrate. He walked for what felt like an hour, seeing nothing but road and trees and stars overhead. No lights, no buildings, no signs of human habitation. Then, through the trees to his left, he saw it. A light. Warm and yellow, like a lantern or a candle, visible through the branches. Alexander stopped, relief flooding through him. Someone lived out here. Someone who might have a phone, or at least could let him wait in warmth until morning. He left the road and pushed through the underbrush toward the light. The forest was dense, full of brambles and fallen logs, but he could see the light clearly ahead, guiding him. After about 50 yards, he emerged into a small clearing, and there was a cabin. It was old, very old, built from hand-hewn logs that had darkened with age. A stone chimney rose from one end, smoke curling from it. A single window glowed with warm light, and on the porch, an oil lantern hung from a hook, swaying slightly in the breeze. The whole scene looked like something from a century ago, perfectly preserved, untouched by modernity. Alexander climbed the porch steps and knocked on the wooden door. He heard movement inside, slow footsteps, and then the door opened. An elderly woman stood there, small and thin, with white hair pulled back in a bun and a face lined with decades of living. She wore a simple dress, the kind Alexander had seen in historical photographs, and she looked at him with bright, intelligent eyes. "Good evening," Alexander said, trying to sound calm despite his relief at finding help. "I'm sorry to bother you so late. My car broke down on the road, and I was hoping I could use your phone to call for help." The woman smiled, and her expression was kind. "Of course, dear. Come in, come in. You must be freezing." Alexander stepped inside, and the warmth of the cabin enveloped him. A fire burned in the stone fireplace, and the interior was lit by oil lanterns. The furniture was old, handmade pieces that looked like genuine antiques. A wood-burning stove stood in one corner, and the smell of baked bread hung in the air. It was like stepping back in time. "Sit, sit," the woman said, gesturing to a chair near the fire. "Would you like some tea? I just made a pot." Alexander thanked her and sat down, grateful to be off his feet and out of the cold. The woman moved slowly to the stove, poured tea into a delicate china cup, and brought it to him. The tea was hot and sweet, herbal, soothing. As Alexander sipped his tea, the woman sat across from him in a rocking chair and began to talk. She told him about growing up in these mountains in the late 1800s, about what life was like before electricity and automobiles. She talked about her husband, who had worked as a logger and died young, leaving her to raise their children alone. She talked about the hard winters, the struggles, the small joys of mountain life. Alexander listened, fascinated. Her stories were vivid and detailed, full of historical information that he had never heard before. She talked about the Civil War reaching these mountains, about families torn apart by choosing different sides. She talked about the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918, about how it had devastated the small communities. She was an incredible storyteller, and Alexander found himself completely absorbed. After maybe 20 minutes of stories, Alexander remembered why he was there. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but could I use your phone? I really need to call for help with my car." The woman smiled and pointed to a small table near the door. "The phone is right there, dear. Help yourself." Alexander stood and walked to the table. There, sitting next to an oil lamp, was a modern cell phone. Not an old rotary phone, not a landline, but a current model smartphone. The incongruity of it in this cabin full of antiques struck him as odd, but he was too grateful to question it. He picked up the phone. It was fully charged, had signal, everything. He dialed a local towing service that he found in the phone's browser, explained his situation, and was told they would send someone within the hour. He thanked the woman profusely. She waved off his gratitude. "You just be careful out there on these roads, especially at night. The mountains are not always safe. Strange things happen in the dark." Alexander promised he would be careful. The woman walked him to the door, and as he was leaving, she said something that he would remember for the rest of his life. "The woods are old, and they remember. They remember everyone who has walked among these trees. You be respectful, and they will let you pass." Alexander thanked her again and stepped out into the night. He followed his flashlight beam back through the forest to the road, his mind already composing how he would tell this story to his friends. An old woman living without electricity in the middle of nowhere, except for somehow having a charged cell phone. It was strange, but mountain people were often eccentric. He made it back to his car and waited. The tow truck arrived exactly when promised. The driver, a friendly man in his 40s named Doug. As the driver hooked up Alexander's car, Alexander mentioned the cabin, thinking maybe Doug knew the woman. "I found help at a cabin about 50 yards into the woods back there. An elderly woman let me use her phone." Doug stopped what he was doing and looked at Alexander with a strange expression. "A cabin? Back in those woods?" Alexander nodded. "Yeah, old log cabin, very rustic. Sweet lady, must be in her 80s or 90s. Doug walked to the side of the road where Alexander had emerged from the forest and shone his work light into the trees. "Son, there has not been a standing structure in this area for 70 years. The old homesteads were all abandoned back in the 40s and 50s when the national forest expanded. Most have rotted away to nothing but foundation stones." Alexander felt cold that had nothing to do with the night air. "That is impossible. I was just there. I sat in her cabin, drank tea, used her phone." Doug's expression was serious now. "Show me." They walked into the forest together, Alexander leading the way, trying to retrace his path. They pushed through the undergrowth, Alexander certain they were going in the right direction. He had only been gone maybe 20 minutes. The cabin should be right here. They emerged into a clearing, and Alexander's blood ran cold. There was no cabin, just an empty space in the forest, overgrown with grass and weeds. In the center were foundation stones, ancient and crumbling, arranged in a rectangle that matched the size of the cabin he had been in. The stone chimney was there, but it was a ruin, collapsed to half its original height, covered in moss and vines. Doug shone his light around the clearing. "This is the old Henderson place. Sarah Henderson lived here alone after her husband died in a logging accident back in 1920. She raised 3 kids by herself, was known for being kind to travelers who got lost in these mountains. She died in 1952, and the cabin stood empty for another 20 years before it finally collapsed. Alexander walked to where the door would have been, where he had stood just minutes before. The foundation stones were barely visible under decades of leaf litter. There was no way a structure had stood here recently. No way anyone had been living here. He pulled out his phone to check the number he had called for the tow truck. The call was in his history, but the number was disconnected, listed to a service that had gone out of business in 1999. Doug watched him, his expression sympathetic. "You are not the first person to report seeing Sarah Henderson. Every few years, someone breaks down on this stretch of road, goes looking for help, and finds her cabin. She always helps them. Lets them use a phone that should not work, gives them tea, tells them stories. And then they come back to thank her and find nothing but ruins." "But how?" Alexander asked, his voice barely a whisper. Doug shook his head. "Some people are so good, so kind, that even death does not stop them from helping others. Sarah spent her whole life helping people in these mountains. Maybe she is still doing it. Maybe her spirit is so tied to this place, to helping lost travelers, that she cannot move on." They walked back to the road in silence. The tow truck came, had a physical truck and a real driver, took Alexander's car to a garage in the nearest town. Alexander rode in the cab, not speaking, trying to process what had happened. He had sat in a cabin that did not exist. He had drunk tea made by a woman who died 70 years ago. He had used a phone that was somehow both real and impossible. Days later, after his car was fixed and he was back in Knoxville, Alexander did research. He found records of Sarah Henderson, found her obituary from 1952. The photograph in the old newspaper was the same woman he had met, decades younger, but unmistakably the same person. He found stories from other travelers, going back decades, reporting encounters with an old woman in a cabin on that stretch of road. Always the same story. Always the same kindness. Alexander has driven that road a dozen times since, always at night, always hoping to see the light through the trees again. He wants to thank her properly, wants to understand what happened, but the cabin has never appeared again. The clearing where it once stood remains empty, just foundation stones and the ruins of a chimney, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. But he keeps Sarah Henderson's story in his heart. In a world where so much is uncertain and frightening, where the mountains hold darkness and danger, there is also this: a woman whose kindness was so profound that it transcended death itself, who continues to help lost travelers decades after her body turned to dust. The woods are old, and they remember. They remember Sarah Henderson, and they let her stay, a light in the darkness, a helping hand for those who lose their way. Some ghosts are not meant to frighten. Some are meant to remind us that goodness, once established, becomes eternal. And in the Appalachian Mountains, on dark roads where travelers break down far from help, sometimes an old cabin appears, smoke rising from its chimney, a lantern on the porch, and inside a kind woman waits, ready to offer tea and warmth and a phone call home. Even if she has been gone for 70 years, Sarah Henderson still helps those who need her.